Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China on Tibet, barriers to settling an unresolved conflict will come to order. More than 70 years after the invasion that led to Chinese rule in Tibet, Tibetans continue to struggle in the face of unrelenting opposition. Chinese authorities routinely violate Tibetans' freedoms of religion, expression, and assembly, as well as denying Tibetans self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party has waged a years-long campaign of Sinicization, requiring conformity with officially sanctioned interpretations of religion and culture, not the authentic practice and teaching of Tibetan Buddhism. Contrary to that practice and teaching, the Chinese government even insists on its own authority to select the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, who authorities label a security threat. Those who express reverence to the Dalai Lama are punished. Also punished are those who express dissatisfaction with Chinese rule in Tibet. These punishments range from warnings to surveillance to interrogation and detention. The Commission's political prisoner database currently includes records of 715 Tibetans detained or imprisoned for political or religious reasons. We note that there are considerably more cases of detention in China than we can capture in the database. Increasingly, this oppression threatens the religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of the Tibetan people. Earlier this year, we heard testimony about insidious efforts to separate Tibetan children from their parents, with nearly 80% of all Tibetan children now placed in boarding schools to disrupt the intergenerational transfer of language and culture. We are observing an extension or expansion of that practice now to children going to kindergarten. This commission has documented these kinds of human rights violations in Tibet for 20 years, and we will continue to do so. In today's hearing, our focus turns to the dialogue needed to address the aspirations of the Tibetan people for their basic rights and self-determination to be respected. Sadly, that dialogue has been frozen for 12 years as Chinese authorities refuse to meet with the Dalai Lama or his representatives. The longstanding policy of the United States is to promote dialogue without preconditions to lead to a negotiated agreement on Tibet. In other words, we recognize that this remains an unsettled conflict that must be addressed. Yet the Chinese government would have the world believe that Tibet is an internal affair and that issues of its status are resolved. This narrative ignores Tibet's history, and today's hearing aims to set the historical record straight. Our witnesses will share with us their considerable experience analyzing the history of Tibet, the international law dimensions of the conflict, the barriers to resuming dialogue, and U.S. policy on Tibet. I hope this hearing helps cut through Chinese propaganda and bring attention to the true historical underpinnings of the Tibetan quest for autonomy. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. It's good to have you here. International Campaign for Tibet. Dignitaries, other friends of Tibet, who are with us this morning while they are in town for the 8th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet. Thank you for joining us. The causes of Tibetan human rights and self-determination need champions all over the globe, and I look forward to continuing to work with my fellow parliamentarians to advance the causes of human dignity and freedom wherever we can. Among global elected officials, few have been as great friends of Tibet as my co-chair, Congressman McGovern, who for many years has led the charge in the U.S. Congress to pass legislation and advocate for the Tibetan people. I now recognize him for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to welcome our friends who are visiting Washington for the World Parliamentary Conference on Tibet. I want to especially welcome the members of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. We have 2 members of Canadian Parliament here. I want to welcome my friends from ICT, and I want to welcome my dear friend Richard Gere, who has been an incredible activist and advocate for human rights in Tibet, and so we're delighted that you are all here. I appreciate that we're holding this hearing on Tibet, the status of dialogue, and a path forward in the Tibetan quest for rights and dignity. Congress has had a long and abiding interest in Tibet. It created Tibetan language broadcasting, scholarships and exchanges for Tibetans, and aid programs in Tibet and in exile. In 2002, Congress passed the landmark Tibetan Policy Act and codified the position of Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues. Support for Tibet transcends the partisan divide. Congressman Tom Lantos and Senator Jesse Helms stood side by side with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So did President Bush and Speaker Pelosi, who presented him with the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007. I've had the honor of authoring the two most recent Tibet bills to be enacted into law. The Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act seeks to enable diplomats, journalists, and tourists travel and see Tibet with their own eyes because Chinese officials have closed it off. The Tibetan Policy and Support Act expands the U.S. policy approach. As its key feature, the bill makes it U.S. policy that the succession or reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist leaders, including a future 15th Dalai Lama, is an exclusively religious matter that should be decided solely by the Tibetan Buddhist community, not by China. Congress and the U.S. government have advocated for the human rights and religious freedom of the Tibetan people. But the core problem remains that the Tibetan people cannot advocate for themselves. They are forced to live in an authoritarian system under a paranoid central government that sees any expression of distinct identity as a threat to their power. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, says it doesn't have to be this way. He's right. For decades, he sought to negotiate with Chinese authorities. He did so in good faith. The Chinese side did agree to 10 rounds of dialogue. They talked to the Dalai Lama's envoys, but they did not do so in good faith. Chinese officials say they will return to the table only if the Dalai Lama meets certain demands that are not only unreasonable, but false. The U.S. government, to its credit, has consistently called on the Chinese to return to dialogue without preconditions, but that hasn't worked. For 12 years, the Tibetans stood ready. The Americans asked, but the Chinese turned away. Should we keep doing it this way, or should we explore some other tactic or strategy? That's the question we will explore in this hearing. Our witnesses today bring expertise and a variety of perspectives, legal, historical, policy, and personal, on the Tibet-China dialogue. We hope to hear what Congress and the U.S. government can do to help. Should we be countering false Chinese narratives? Should we reorient how we talk about the basis for dialogue? Is dialogue even possible in the current environment, and what would be the alternatives? So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to consider these important questions, and I look forward to our hearing.
And Congressman Smith, I know you're with us on Zoom. Did you wish to make an opening comment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief, and I thank you again, our co-chair, for convening this important hearing. I also want to welcome our distinguished witnesses, and including Richard Gere, who has been an extraordinary advocate for the people of Tibet, and especially for the Dalai Lama. Simply put, the barrier, obviously, is the Chinese Communist Party. It has an ideological commitment to control Tibet far beyond what previous Chinese governments sought to do, which has been evident since the founding of the People's Republic of China. Indeed, 1 year after the communist government took power in Beijing and completed its control of the mainland, it invaded Tibet and sought to annex it. In 1959, of course, marked an even greater attempt to control Tibet and led to the dramatic flight of the Dalai Lama from his home country. All these years, he has been in exile, and while the world has benefited from his personal holiness and his example, he truly is a treasure. But again, as I was saying, the Dalai Lama is a treasure that we've all, and I, like my other colleagues, have met him and have been so deeply impressed by his goodness and his holiness. When we saw the extreme cruelty of the Cultural Revolution, where Maoist Red Guards despoiled so much of Tibet's religious and cultural patrimony, then, of course, there was the kidnapping and disappearance of the Panchen Lama, which personalizes how evil and totalitarian is the CCP and underscores the extent to which they will go to deny the Tibetan people the right to practice their faith freely and without interference. Now, today, under Xi Jinping, the suppression of Tibetan Buddhism Indeed, the suppression of all religion, which Xi Jinping seeks to synthesize, has intensified the Chinese Communist Party's intent upon committing cultural genocide. This must end. The Tibetan people must be free to practice their own faith and to choose their own spiritual leaders. And again, we look forward to our distinguished witnesses for giving us guidance on the path forward. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And we'd now like to introduce those witnesses. I'll introduce all of them at the beginning. Michael von Walt von Prague is a professor of international law and executive president of CRADA, an international non-governmental organization created to help prevent and resolve violent interstate conflicts. He is the author of Tibet Brief 2020, and he previously served as legal advisor to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Han-Xing Lau is a retired professor who taught at the City University of Hong Kong, Oklahoma State University, and Washington State University. Since retiring, he has devoted his time to Chinese history. He is the author of the book, Tibet Was Never Part of China Since Antiquity. Tenzing Taitong is a former Tibetan government official and representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to North America. He served in several roles in the Central Tibetan Administration, including as Kalon Tripa, the equivalent of Prime Minister. He has served as the Director of the Tibetan Language Service at Radio Free Asia and is currently the Director of the Tibetan Language Service at Voice of America, and he is testifying in his personal capacity. And Ellen Bork will be joining us by Zoom. She is contributing editor at the American Purpose. She previously served as a senior professional staff member for Asia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and writes frequently about U.S. policy toward Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Dispatch, the Washington Post, and other publications. Thank you all for joining us for this hearing, and without objection, your full statements will be entered into the record. We ask that you keep your oral remarks to about 5 minutes. And so we'll start with Michael von Walt von Prague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My testimony today is based on the findings of 10 years of collaborative research, historical and legal, most of which I carried out during my tenure at the School of Historical Studies of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and the findings are published in these two books. Today, I'd like to call your attention to one of those findings and its international legal ramifications. Contrary to what the PRC claims, Tibet was historically not a part of China. Though not always independent in the modern legal sense of the term, and over the centuries subject to various degrees of Mongol, Manchu, and even British authority or influence, Tibet was never a part of China. The PRC did not inherit Tibet from the Republic of China or from earlier empires as it claims. Tibet was in fact an independent state in the modern sense of the term, in fact and law from 1912 to 1951, when the PRC took it by force. So the PRC's military invasion of Tibet constituted an act of aggression and violated the peremptory norm of international law prohibiting the acquisition of territory by the use of force against another state. And this informs the legitimacy, or not, of China's presence and rule of Tibet. China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, and therefore it is occupying Tibet illegally. That, in turn, informs the international community's legal obligations and its responsibilities regarding the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Governments are prohibited under international law from recognizing China's annexation of Tibet, and they have the positive obligation to help bring about a resolution of the Sino-Tibetan conflict, to end the occupation of Tibet, and to enable the Tibetan people to exercise self-determination. As you stated, it is US policy to support a negotiated resolution to the conflict between China and Tibet. but US government actions run counter to that policy. The US government has stated more than once that it considers Tibet to be a part of the PRC. If it and other governments continue to do so, Beijing no longer will have any incentive to negotiate with the Tibetans. The international community will have satisfied the PRC's needs without Beijing having to make any concessions to the Tibetans. The PRC wants two things above anything else regarding Tibet: legitimacy and no foreign interference or criticism. Beijing's strategy to obtain legitimacy in Tibet from the Tibetans is failing. The Dalai Lama disputes the PRC's only claim to entitlement to Tibet, namely that Tibet has been an integral part of China since antiquity. And he is not giving in to pressure to make a statement to that effect. Beijing has therefore started demanding of other governments that they recognize that Tibet is part of China and is using their statements as a substitute for true legitimacy. Once a government accepts to regard Tibet as part of the PRC, it also accepts that Tibet and Sino-Tibetan relations are China's internal affair, outside its purview. Beijing's needs are then satisfied, and the Tibetan negotiating power, which depends heavily on the international community's upholding of international law in keeping with Tibet's status as an occupied country, is then severely weakened. And not only that, endorsing China's sovereignty claim to Tibet conditions the Tibetans to envision a settlement that can bring only marginal change in Tibet. Given what we know about China's treatment of Tibetans and also its treatment of Uyghurs, and Beijing's determination to eradicate their very identity, I ask, is marginal change what the US really wants for the Tibetan people? The conflict will not be resolved with marginal change. It can only truly be resolved if the Tibetans' basic needs are satisfied. At a very minimum, this requires a robust autonomy with guarantees and international protection endorsed by the Tibetan people in accordance with their right to self-determination. To arrive there, the international community needs to play its role, uphold international law, treat Tibet as an occupied country, and the conflict as a matter of international responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll now turn to Professor Lau.
I want to thank this distinguished audience for enabling me to make this presentation. My theme is China's pre-1949 official historical records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before the PRC invaded Tibet in 1950. This is an important issue because China is a signatory to the relevant covenants of the League of Nations and the United Nations, which means that since 1919, China has promised not to gain territories through military conquest thereafter. Moreover, the PRC incessantly condemns other countries for their past colonial conquests and the past bullying of China. Therefore, the PRC needs to cover up its 1950 Tibet conquest as a unification of a territory that has been part of China since antiquity. Sadly, today many governments incorrectly believe this ridiculous lie, and this is part of the reason why many Western democracies fail to provide adequate support for upholding Tibet's sovereignty. There are two important foundation concepts behind my theme. Foundation A, there is an abundance of authentic and reliable pre-1949 Chinese official historical records. The PRC version of Chinese history is very, very different from the version of Chinese history reflected in these pre-1949 official Chinese records. Foundation B, we use a comprehensive range of objective criteria to examine whether Tibet was part of China. Thus, to judge whether Tibet was part of China during China's Ming Dynasty, we use official classical Chinese records to examine, for example, number one, whether the Ming Empire had designated Tibet as part of China or as a foreign entity, say via a promulgated map. Number two, was the Ming Empire able to conduct census or collect taxes in Tibet? Number three, was the Ming Empire able to appoint or dismiss judges or governing officials in Tibet? Number four, was China's language, legal system, and monetary system used in Tibet, etc., etc.? Combining foundations A and B, we can prove the following conclusion. China's pre-1949 official records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before PRC's 1950 invasion. We also prove that PRC's so-called evidence of sovereignty over Tibet are based on not only distortions, but outright fabrications and forgeries of pre-1949 Chinese records. This means that a current permanent member of the UN Security Council militarily conquered a foreign country in 1950 and continues to subjugate it today. This crime obligates the intervention of the international community. I'm going to show you examples of these proofs. The first example is of a Ming Dynasty map. It's on your tablet. This is labeled as map 1, purported to show the entire Ming Empire. Regarding my foundation A stated earlier, this proof is from a Ming Dynasty 1461 AD government publication. That is, it comes from a very authoritative Chinese source. Regarding my foundation B, it relates to an objective sovereignty claim, depiction on a national map. This map labels, if you look at the map, you will show that the Chinese territories, the labels are framed in white lettering on black background. In contrast, it labels non-Chinese territories such as Japan in the east, and then Tibet over here on the west, in non-framed black lettering on white background. The contrast is literally in black and white. In other words, the Ming government clearly declares that Tibet is a non-China foreign entity. If you would flip the tablet, you would see that map number 2 is an example of a Qing Dynasty proof. This is from a Qing Dynasty 1732 government publication, purported to show the entire Qing Empire. On this map, the Qing government shows the position corresponding to today's Tibet Autonomous Region, which is the TAR, as a blank space. Hundreds of similar proofs are presented in this book that I've written. Most of them involve textual records and not just merely pictorial proofs like this, and they are, of course, much more reliable. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much for your comments and for sharing these maps and this history. And we will now turn to Mr. Taetong.
Chairman Merkley and Co-Chair McGovern, it is my distinct honor to offer testimony this morning on this hearing on Tibet and to speak briefly on Tibetan-Chinese relations in the 20th century, including efforts towards a resolution of the Tibet issue. Tibet remains an unresolved conflict ever since the establishment of the People's Republic of China. One of Mao Zedong's earliest declarations was his intention to liberate Tibet from the West and the Tibetan people from a backward and oppressive society. The Tibetan government protested immediately, citing Tibet's historical independence from the time of Tibetan kings to the rule of the Dalai Lamas, from the Tang to the Manchu Qing dynasties. With equal urgency, Tibet appealed to the United Nations and the global community, especially to India, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Unfortunately, China did not heed Tibet's protests, and the global community did not come to Tibet's defense. The People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet in 1950, easily overwhelming the Tibetan army and militia. China knew right then that rhetorical justification for such an invasion was not enough and called for negotiations to formalize an agreement. Tibetan representatives negotiated in Beijing, but disregarding any proper ratification process, were forced to sign what is called the 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Nevertheless, for the next 9 years, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government tried to work within the broad confines of the agreement, which promised no change in the status of the Dalai Lama or the Tibetan government. However, China did not live up to these commitments, nor to the personal assurances the Dalai Lama had received from Mao Zedong. Tibetan dissatisfaction was widespread during these years, and protests against the Chinese finally culminated in the uprising in Lhasa on March 10, 1959, which led to the escape of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and thousands to India and neighboring countries. For the next 20 years, Tibet was completely shut off from the rest of the world. An extreme overhaul of Tibetan life, from its traditional Buddhist roots to Chinese Marxist socialism, was introduced, which in the latter years were consumed by the madness of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. However, in early 1979, China deemed the Tibetan issue important enough to be revisited. Deng Xiaoping invited the Dalai Lama's older brother to Beijing and declared that short of separation, everything could be discussed, meaning that short of granting Tibetan independence, China would be open to all Tibetan concerns and aspirations. This breakthrough meeting led to a renewed dialogue between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government, and 4 delegations of exiled leaders were able to visit Tibet extensively to see and learn what had transpired in the 2 decades of Chinese rule. By 1984, representatives of the exiled government were in deliberations with Chinese officials to address larger issues related to Tibet. However, in 1987, Hu Yabang, Party General Secretary and the main proponent of changes in their Tibet policies, died. This was soon followed by the Tiananmen students' protests and the massacre. China stepped backwards and the Tibetan issue also retreated. In 2001, however, communication with China was restored, and envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama began meeting in Beijing, and the Tibetan side presented His Holiness the Dalai Lama's middle way policy, seeking genuine autonomy for Tibet within the framework of the PRC. The envoys met many times, even after the unprecedented 2008 Tibet-wide protests that called for greater freedom for the Tibetan people. However, the envoys' last meeting was to be in 2010, when the Chinese ended the dialogue process. This brief overview of Tibetan-Chinese relations should show that even at the most challenging of times, China has seen the need to address the legitimacy of their rule in Tibet, and that there is perhaps now a realization of the shortcomings of their rule. China has also repeatedly initiated direct communication with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, demonstrating the obvious need to find a meaningful resolution to these outstanding issues. Ever since the exile delegation visit to Tibet in the 1980s, to the later meetings of the Dalai Lama's envoys in Beijing, the Chinese leadership has been made much more aware of Tibetan perspectives of their rule in Tibet and of the unvarnished aspirations of the Tibetan people, both of which contradict the official Chinese narrative. Worldwide attention to Tibet has been an important part of creating greater awareness of the Tibetan issue, even in China, allowing for more liberal and reasonable views of the Dalai Lama and of Tibetan hopes and demands to have some standing. There is little doubt that public support for Tibet through the person of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and concerns for the cultural and human rights of the Tibetan people have been important factors in the US government's attention to the issue, one which has been sustained to a large degree by individual members of Congress. The continued efforts of the United States will only help remove barriers to this unresolved conflict, and it will advance the Tibetan people's desire for greater freedom and democracy. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taetong. And we're now going to turn to Ellen Bork, who is joining us via Zoom. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the members of the commission and staff, and I appreciate appearing alongside the other witnesses very much. As you all know, the United States has charted a new course towards China on a lot of issues, but Tibet so far has not been the subject of considerable revision, but it should be. Unfortunately, Tibet is often viewed as a fait accompli, a tragic but closed chapter of history. That is not the case, of course, for the party, the Chinese Communist Party. Tibet, for them, remains a cornerstone of China's aggression, both territorially and ideologically. It is part of China's assault on liberal democratic norms, which in turn will advance the party's plan to control the succession of the Dalai Lama, or at least gain deference and acquiescence to its choice of impostor. Addressing that challenge by building support for the authentic Dalai Lama now and in the future, and in particular building support for Tibetan democracy, which is his legacy, a much larger role in the U.S. response to China. Unfortunately, the foundations of American Tibet policy make this difficult. A look back at history shows America's Tibet policy was not the product of historical facts or international law, but of outdated perceptions of America's strategic interest in subordinating Tibet to China. The U.S. involvement in Tibet is, compared to some other powers, relatively recent, but it has played a decisive role in what's happening today. First, of course, the United States accepted Great Britain's application of the concept of suzerainty over Tibet. This is something short of sovereignty. It doesn't really, according to many scholars, it is not even applicable, but Great Britain found it useful while it was involved in the great geopolitical competition of the great game in the region. The United States accepted that term, but if you read through a lot of the diplomatic memos, you'll see how uncomfortable and ambivalent officials were about it, and as well as about the term, as well as about the concept of sovereignty. And for several decades, policy fluctuated in terms of the language used and the way the United States thought about what had happened in Tibet from the 1950s. And even before, the officials really accepted that it was de facto independent, even though the United States refused to accept requests to recognize Tibet's independence. Later on, after several decades only, it was when the United States forged a rapprochement with Beijing at Taipei's expense that the position on sovereignty really gelled. And again, this was the result of its perception of a strategic need with regard to China, and deciding to choose one Chinese priority in Tibet over another. And it's not, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that in that way it transferred deference to China over Tibet from one dictatorship that never exerted authority there, meaning Chiang Kai-shek, to a totalitarian regime which it had decided to favor at the time. As a result of this decision, which incidentally Vice President Mondale visited Beijing in 1979 and sort of said, we will no longer view the Dalai Lama as a political leader. And we've essentially said we're we're going with your sovereignty over Tibet. Not surprisingly, with that decision taken, Tibet had to become diminished within U.S. PRC relations. And it's not uncommon for diplomats to consider that it's an irritant in the U.S.-China relationship, and even that Tibet can only be helped if we lower the temperature with Beijing over Tibet, which I think is exactly the opposite. Above all, this meant that the United States would not focus on legitimacy questions about the PRC's role in Tibet or give adequate attention to the extraordinary achievement of democracy in exile. That democratization process was carried out under the Dalai Lama's leadership and with the support of the Tibetan people in exile at exactly the same time that democratic transitions were occurring in Asia, in the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and later Indonesia. And that has been the basis of American policy toward the region ever since. By contrast, of course, Tibet is a huge priority for the party, and it uses Tibet. It has an international Tibet agenda. It's not just the domestic repression or inside Tibet's border that we need to focus on. It has a really corrosive agenda for Tibet, trying to impose litmus tests on the way countries and NGOs deal with Tibet. And it has a Buddhist agenda in its Belt and Road investment initiatives. It seeks to appropriate Buddhist sites and cultivate and co-opt leaders and make Tibet as a core interest, a condition of its good relations. I'd just like to note, before I give a few recommendations, the importance of understanding that many brave Chinese democracy advocates have over time challenged the party on Tibet. It's very easy to imagine Chinese people are sort of inherently nationalist when it comes to Tibet. And I think that's false. It's the product of intense propaganda and fear. And it's important to recognize that going back to Wei Jingsheng and continuing to Liu Xiaobo, there's been a thrust among Chinese Democrats increasingly to see democracy as the solution to both Tibet's and China's problems. Charter 08, the Democracy Manifesto of 2008, took this up. And although I think it was too sensitive to use the word Tibet in that document, there was a clear reference to the goal of a federal democratic communities of China. In that sense, the first recommendation I would make is to reintroduce support for democracy in China and to support Chinese and Tibetan political prisoners and activists, lawyers, and journalists more than we currently are in our relationship with Beijing. I think I'd like to suggest also an independent review of U.S. policy to go deeply into some of the issues I mentioned about the choices the United States made from the 40s on to see how the United States how its policy or its attitudes about Tibet's status fluctuated and why it made these decisions, and how they are not related. As Michael points out, our position is in violation of international law. How did this happen, and what should we understand about not only Tibet's status, but how the United States treated Tibet and subordinated to China historically? And finally, I would say we should enlist allies in a common position on the Dalai Lama's succession and make that very public, give the elected Tibetan exile government more access and support, and include it in forums like the Summit for Democracy, and counter Chinese influence in international organizations and campuses and the state and local levels, not only on Tibet, but on other questions like Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bork. And really, the expertise that all four of you bring to this conversation. We'll now have a series of periods of questioning, and I think we're set for 7 minutes. And I'll be handing the gavel over to Representative McGovern after my questions, because I have another hearing to chair. But tell you, this member of the Senate will never recognize as legitimate Chinese control over Tibet. And the hearings that we have held in this commission about what China is now doing in Tibet, and in particular, I will can't get out of my mind the fact that 80% of the children are being sent to boarding school to separate them from their parents and to essentially re-educate them in a false narrative and destroy the religious and cultural foundations of the Tibetan people. And this is truly an enormous crime against Tibet. I appreciate your historical perspectives. I was struck by two of you testifying about 1979. Mr. Taitong, you noted that in 1979, Deng Xiaoping invited the Dalai Lama's older brother to come and to say, short of separation, China was open to discussion of how to address Tibetan concerns and aspirations. And then Ms. Bork, you noted in 1979 that Vice President Mondale went to China and essentially recognized, if I understood your testimony correctly, recognized that the United States saw China as having legitimate authority over Tibet. How do we reconcile these two things happening in that particular year? How did one precede the other? And are they tied together? And I'd invite both Ms. Bork and Mr. Taitong to help us understand that.
Mr. Chairman, I think, as I was trying to explain very briefly, even though China had just come out of a very serious period of the Cultural Revolution, to set China on the right course, they had to deal with many important issues. And obviously, Tibet was right up there in their agenda.
Let's make sure your mic is turned on so that we're getting this recorded for...
Yes, it is. It shows that Tibet remains a key issue in the Chinese government's state of mind. Unfortunately, what Vice President Mondale declared during the Carter administration was overlooking the importance of the Tibetan human rights situation. In part, maybe we were unable to present our case to a president who had strong interest in human rights, but maybe at the time, President Carter was very engaged in establishing normalized relations with China. That's all I can say.
Thank you. And Ms. Bork, would you like to comment on the same kind of juxtaposition of those two events in 1979?
Thank you very much. I don't know the interaction or the interplay between those two events, and I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. I suspect, getting the Tibetan leadership to acquiesce, to sort of buy into some solution, is not inconsistent with getting the United States to, sort of settle its position on its sovereignty over Tibet. So, but it would be very interesting. I've done a little research. It's not easy to know what went into the preparation for Vice President Mondale's trip. I think that would be a great subject for an independent commission.
Okay. Thank you. Let me turn to our two professors, Professor Lau and Professor Michael von Prague. Where is American leverage in bringing China back to the conversation through the dialogue about autonomy for Tibet?
Thank you. Because China's primary objective in relation to its international, in the international field in relation to Tibet, is precisely to obtain legitimacy for its rule in Tibet. Questioning that legitimacy creates leverage. In other words, in the reverse, accepting or otherwise identifying Tibet as a part of China or as a part of the PRC or accepting Chinese sovereignty over Tibet today takes away any leverage the Tibetans have. It takes away the need for the Chinese leaders to approach the Tibetans, to negotiate with them, and to find an agreement that will end up with an arrangement where the Tibetans accept some form of Chinese sovereignty, rule, relationship that works for both parties. If the international community, and therefore the US, as perhaps one of the most important players in relation to China, do not question China's legitimacy in Tibet, China's sovereignty in Tibet, then that takes away that leverage.
Thank you. Professor Lau?
Thank you, sir. I can only echo what Michael has just said. I think that the United States and the world should actively counter and oppose the PRC's narrative by producing sort of solid proofs of why the PRC's version is incorrect or they're just basically telling lies. I think in the past, I've heard many people sort of denying the truth, but without producing believable and authoritative proofs. I think it's about time when the world becomes more explicit in contradicting the PRC's claim by doing just more than saying, you are wrong, I'm right, but show the proofs. That's all I know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll close with this question to Ms. Bork. Thank you, by the way, for your 5 recommendations. And one of the things you talk about is enlisting allies in a united position on the integrity of the Tibetan process for selecting the next Dalai Lama. And can you comment for just a moment, kind of the general sense of the disposition of the European Union, both in terms of that specific issue, but more broadly, the issue of establishing a clear united position that China control or authority is illegitimate over Tibet?
Thank you, Senator. There's no question that the Chinese government has made great inroads in Europe, but that, I think, on a number of issues has been slowed, if not completely reversed. Like in the United States, I think Tibet is there are many countries where there's great reverence for Tibet at the Dalai Lama. It's not viewed there quite as a strategic matter. It doesn't get quite as much attention. I think that the attention to the reincarnation issue that the U.S. Congress has showed is also spreading in Europe. I'm optimistic that some of the leading countries there in support for the Dalai Lama would step forward, but they've always been treated to that kind of divide and conquer. They've suffered so much, as you remember, the way Norway suffered after the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. So it's essential that there's some kind of burden and protection for countries as they take this position. I'm very heartened by the appointment of the new special coordinator, Uzra Zaya, and believe that there is prospect for greater attention to Tibet within U.S.-Europe relations.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to turn to Co-Chairman McGovern.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all the panelists for being here. And let me make clear, the reason why we're doing this hearing, the reason why we've done other hearings on Tibet, the reason why we have passed legislation on Tibet is because China is not living up to the expectations of the international community with regard to Tibet. And, you know, I think there might be a perception in China that the world will soon forget and move on to something else. But I hope we're making it clear that that's not going to be the case. In fact, activity in the United States Congress on Tibet has intensified in recent years. More attention is being devoted to Tibet. And some of the topics that we're talking about here today, many members of Congress are unaware of. And they will be enlightened by this hearing. And it will bring additional perspective as we deal with other legislation impacting China in the future. So I just say to the government of China, who always gets annoyed when we do these hearings, you know what? You have a Tibet problem, and you can deal with it. You can go back to the negotiating table. I mean, that would be a good first step. And let's try to resolve these differences. But as long as you don't, as long as you pretend that there's not a problem here, please be assured that activity on Tibet, focus on Tibet in the United States and in other countries around the world will intensify. So, Professor Lau, would you say that the Chinese government's insistence that the Dalai Lama say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity is tantamount to a demand that the Dalai Lama say something that is false?
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. The PRC knows that that claim is a lie, and they are forcing the Dalai Lama to lie with the PRC.
Thank you. Mr. Van Walt, you testify that governments using the Chinese narrative that Tibet has always been part of China is an obstacle to resolving the conflict through dialogue. Now, there has been no dialogue in 12 years. Assuming that governments made such statements as a concession to get the Chinese to the table back then, is there any reason for them to continue saying the same thing?
I think it was a mistake for governments to play China's game, and in the hope that, and I don't know what the objective was of making those statements, acknowledging Tibet being a part of the PRC. But I think it was a mistake to do so if the hope was that this would encourage China to negotiate. I think it's quite the contrary. And I think we must realize that the middle way approach of His Holiness can only work if we're conscious that the kind of genuine autonomy that we're talking about is only a possible middle path if it is the middle between the legitimate right of the Tibetans to restore their independence on the one hand, and China's intention to fully integrate Tibet into China on the other. If we take away this legitimate right of the Tibetans, then there's really very little to negotiate that is left.
So I think it's fair to say that those governments that bought into the Chinese narrative may be thinking that that might make the Chinese government more reasonable with regard to Tibet. It didn't work.
It didn't work, and I think it is counterproductive today.
Mr. Taitong, the Chinese insist that they have the right to select the next Dalai Lama and demand that the Dalai Lama say that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Do you think that these reveal a latent insecurity within Chinese leadership about the legitimacy of their claim to own Tibet?
Definitely, Chairman. We've all touched on this issue of legitimacy, and I believe even within the Chinese leadership and in the Chinese mindset, legitimacy of the rule of the CCP is what is at stake. And Tibet, or the Tibetans, were the ones who contested that legitimacy. That's why there is total control over Tibet, yet China often finds itself in need to address it somehow, because the question of legitimacy will never be fully, satisfactory to the Chinese until the Tibetans have a proper role in that.
Thank you. Ms. Bork, given what the other three witnesses have said, what action should the United States government take to get the parties back to the table? Do you agree that the State Department should stop using the Tibet as part of the PRC phrase, as they did in the Tibet negotiations report this month? And given that the PRC was founded in 1949, would it be fair to say that the U.S. statements do not endorse the Chinese position that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity?
I'm not sure what the intention of the department was in that particular matter, but I do think there's a lot to be done before approaching Beijing. And I think dialogue can take many forms, and people may have different attitudes about it. I'm not a particular supporter of the idea of dialogue, at least not without much more coordination among the allies in support of the Tibetans. I don't think without that, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I'm deeply skeptical about the Chinese intentions with regard to any kind of dialogue. By all means, again, reviewing the defects in the American position, why they've used the language in the past, and the fact that they should stop using it, again, because it's not accurate historically and not helpful right now. Yes, they should stop using that and begin to talk about Tibet in a different way.
And I appreciate